the Islamic civilization was a civilization, it was a qualitative civilization and a quantitative civilization. It was a civilization of ideas in the mind, but it was also a civilization that produced many things in the real world and impacted the real world. And it had two foundational sciences. One of them was grammar. It was a civilization that was obsessed with grammar, and arguably the Muslims probably did more to promote grammar than any other civilization in human history. And we have much debt to the Islamic civilization in terms of language. Even the Jewish tradition, which based their lexicons on the Muslim lexicons, because the Muslims were really the first people to produce serious dictionaries. And we owe a great debt to the Persians for their incredible analysis of the Arabic language, the deconstructing, and then the putting together again of the Arabic language. But grammar was everything to the Muslims because they took language incredibly seriously, and they also wanted to understand revelation. They wanted to know what are all the possibilities of these sentences in the Quran. There's so many possibilities. I'll just give you one example. The Quran says not to debate with the people of the book except in the most beautiful way. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. It says illa. Illa in Arabic is usually used as an exception, except for. But some of our scholars argued in this case, illa here is actually a conjunction meaning and also. But it was done with the illa to point out that it's actually difficult to do that. So there's just an example, and then there are many examples from Arabic poetry where illa is used as a waw al-ataf. It's used as the conjunction and also. That's just one example, but when you get into tafsir, what you see is that our scholars were just trying their best to see and exhaust all the possibilities in every verse in the Quran and in every hadith or statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And the way to do that in their understanding was first and foremost through grammar. And that's why they were obsessed. But the second great obsession of the Muslims was geometry. And this is why everywhere you go in the Muslim world, you will see geometric patterns everywhere. You'll see them in their tessellations. You'll see them in their mosaics. You'll see them in all of the mosques, the great mosques that the Muslims built. Even the great mosques of Turkey, which were designed after the Christian churches. You will see all of this geometry. Euclid was studied obsessively by our scholars. Euclid is reintroduced into European civilization through the great Arabic commentaries on Euclid. The Muslims were literally obsessed with the book of the 13 books of Euclid. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi said that in his Rihla, he said, by the age of 15, I had mastered the 13 books of Euclid, and I was capable of working out star positions with an astrolabe at 15. So you can imagine what kind of civilization that was when the 15-year-olds had done. In our high schools, we study 3 of the 13 books in what's called high school geometry. But one of the things about Euclid and why he's so important, and Euclid is arguably one of the most influential human beings that ever lived. His book had a massive impact on Western and Muslim civilization. But one of the reasons why Euclid's so important is because Euclid is a metaphysician. Euclid, you cannot do those theorems without going to the assumptions. Euclid gives you at the very outset of his book, and then the chapters that need further elucidation, he gives you the axioms, the assumptions, the common notions, and he lets you know that these are things that cannot be proved. These are the first principles. And so what metaphysics is it's going to the first principles. And this is why Muslims always began their sciences with the 10 mabadi, the starting places of their sciences, to let you know a definition. We have now, right next door, a graduating class from Berkeley that are getting BAs. A lot of them are getting BAs, Bachelor of Arts. If you ask them what that BA, what are the arts that you are now a bachelor in, most of them really, I don't think, could answer that question. Because the BA, we inherited the BA from an ancient tradition. which is the tradition of the liberal arts, these sciences that are supposed to free us from the fetters of our faulty thinking. But now it really doesn't have any meaning. And a lot of our students now are given incredible assumptions from their teachers, but they're never taught what are the metaphysical foundations of the civilization. They're never taught about those first principles of the civilization. And just to give you a few very quickly, one of them is that anything that can't be proved empirically or is not true by definition, what they call an analytic proposition, anything other than those two, either empirically provable or something that's true by definition, what they call the verification principle, is gibberish. From gibberish is actually from Jabir, because Jabir ibn Hayyan, his books on chemistry were translated into Latin. They were so difficult to understand, the Latins called them, the medievals called them gibberish. So that's, but literally, metaphysics, theology is now seen as meaningless. If you say there is no God but God, many people in the humanities and philosophy departments today will say that's a meaningless statement. That's an assumption of the civilization. Another foundational assumption that people don't really think about is that science. Do we call, for instance, is Isaac Newton a scientist? Because in many ways, this civilization would not recognize Isaac Newton as a scientist because he had many metaphysical assumptions about his work and his worldview. He believed, for instance, deeply in God. He believed in the Bible. He believed that the world was a supernatural event. Our modern science says that you cannot have recourse to the supernatural to explain anything. And this is why Darwinism makes so much sense, because you've eliminated the metaphysical perspective. You've eliminated the divine. So you cannot explain being by something outside of being. You cannot explain being by something that cannot be proved empirically. And therefore we have to determine, where did life come from? Without God, where did life come from? That is a metaphysical assumption, and that's why Darwin is so compelling, because he's making that assumption. He's assuming that we cannot have recourse to the divine, because if we do, it's no longer scientific. That is an assumption of this civilization. That's not an assumption of our civilization. So these are really important distinctions that are often not made. Another one is the idea, for instance, that belief is irrational. Or people say, why should I have faith in something? Because faith is believing without evidence. This is a very common trope in modern culture. You'll hear it from what they call the new atheists, people like Sam Harris, who will literally say, faith is belief without evidence. That has never been true for the Abrahamic tradition. One of the most important aspects of the Abrahamic traditions was to ground their faith in reason. And they gave you cannot study, if you take a survey course on religion, like the philosophy of religion, they'll do St. Thomas Aquinas, his 5 proofs for the existence of God. And they give them in very superficial, these truncated versions, reductive. You have to spend a great deal of time to understand what Aquinas, and 3 out of the 5 he got from the Muslims. But you have to work very hard to understand why he came to those conclusions. The Summa is a summary of those. He has an entire metaphysical approach to those 5 proofs for the existence of God, which used to take about 15 years before you could actually study those and really understand those proofs. Now they're taught in a philosophy course on religion as if, well, here it is. Here's their proofs for the existence of God. No, those aren't the proofs. Those are the conclusions of the proofs. And the same is true for the Kalam cosmological argument that the Muslims embedded their worldview in. The Kalam cosmological argument takes a good deal of time to understand. It can't be understood simplistically. So our civilization, it's not my contention, it's the contention of some of the most brilliant minds in our civilization right now. One of them is Sayyid Naqib al-Atas, who's a true metaphysician, who really believes that the root of our crisis is a metaphysical crisis. And until we address the metaphysical crisis, we will only be dealing with the superficial. You have the political. You can address things at the political level, but the political level is very superficial. I'll give you one example. In the book of Politics, Aristotle talks about something called stasis, which is civil strife. And he has theories for stasis, why civil strife emerges. He gives the efficient cause, the material cause. He gives the final cause. He doesn't deal with the formal cause of stasis. And the formal cause in Aristotle's approach, his metaphysical approach to understanding things, is always the most important cause to understand what a thing is. Like, what is civil strife? What is it? But it's something that can be understood. You can understand why it happens. And his argument is that you should do all you can to prevent it before it happens. Because if you don't, it's much more difficult to remedy. One example, the Founding Fathers understood that slavery was wrong. They were very aware of the problem of slavery. It wasn't like they didn't know that it was a problem. But because of the economic imperatives they had, they chose not to address the issue. They kicked the ball down the field. They knew that it was going to be addressed. They knew. But they just kicked it down the field. We'll let other people deal with this. And some of the Founding Fathers considered this a grave mistake, like Benjamin Rush. Then the Civil War happens. So now the problem, because it wasn't remedied at the outset, it's a full-blown crisis. We're still dealing today, 150 years later, with what happened over 200 years ago, and then what happened 150 years ago with the Civil War. We're still dealing with the consequences because the root problem was never addressed. The root problem was never addressed. The Syrian Civil War. How did it come about? There are reasons. It can be understood. But they will be dealing with the Syrian Civil War for decades, if not for a century or more. These things don't go away. They're profoundly painful. So we're in a crisis. Just one of the things that we tried to highlight in this was the importance of the centrality. But I just want to... people know who Chertoff is? Anybody remember Chertoff? I know Imam Zaid. He's a political scientist. Of course he knows who he is. Huh? Did anybody know who Chertoff is other than Imam Zaid? Remember Chertoff? Who was he? He's the guy that brought in all that Israeli technology into the airports, right? He was the head of Homeland Security, right? Wasn't he? Yeah. Well, his father was Gershon Chertoff, who did his PhD on Imam al-Ghazali. But in it he says, Ghazali's influence began to be felt in the middle of the 12th century. He did not become an authority for the Jews until much later. During the great controversy about the acceptability and the authority of philosophy, all through the 13th and part of the 14th century, none of the contending parties made use of al-Ghazali's name or any of his treatises, even though his ethical work had already been translated during the early period of the struggle. The important works of al-Ghazali were subsequently translated into Hebrew and played an important role in the Jewish literature of the Middle Ages. We shall limit ourselves, however, mainly to the translation of the Maqasid. The Maqasid serve for the Jews as a textbook of the peripatetic philosophy, according to the version of Ibn Sina. And al-Ghazali, whatever his own attitude in writing the Maqasid, came to be regarded by the Jews, by the virtue of it, as the chief popularizer of philosophy in the Jewish community. Right? So this is a Jew... This is a Jewish man who got his PhD from Columbia University on Ghazali's influence on the Jewish community.